Good morning or afternoon. My name is Jon Austin. I am a Civil War reenactor from Jacksonville, Illinois, and come with a background in museums. So I come to living history from a slightly different perspective, basically that perspective being one of providing public education for anyone who has an interest in learning about the past. At a typical reenactment event, I portray a Civil War embalming surgeon who was a civilian, an actual individual, named Dr. Benjamin Franklin Lyford. And Lyford and other embalming surgeons during the Civil War would travel from battlefield to battlefield, offering their services to the military or to comrades of soldiers who might have fallen in battle. And as a result, many of those individuals who died, or their friends or commanding officers, knew that the individual did not want to simply be buried at the location where they died. And so embalmers then, over 150 years ago, not unlike a funeral director or mortician today, simply works with a family in order to sanitize the human remains so that they don't decompose, and then ensures that they can then survive transportation back to the actual location where they are to be buried ultimately. And the goal, of course, was, as it is today, to be able to send the individual to a funeral ceremony in a condition, hopefully, that will allow them to be viewed so that a family can have psychological closure. So many individuals come to Civil War events having become aware that there might have been some involvement of an undertaker or a funeral director during the Civil War, and mistakenly, unfortunately, they believe that embalming was something that was created during the war, and it really wasn't. Embalming was actually developed or first introduced into America in 1840 by a French chemist, and that individual's experiments led to a process that is not unlike the process that is performed today. The chemicals are different, but the process is identical in that the goal is to simply sanitize the remains or destroy bacteria in a period of time when bacteriology was not understood or recognized. It was recognized that human remains and animal remains would decompose at the time of death, but the actual cause was not understood. And there was also a lack of complete knowledge from the perspective of chemistry, in that they knew that certain chemical agents were effective in destroying what we later identify as microbes, but they didn't know why those products worked. And so, as I mentioned, Lyford and probably close to 20 other men that I've been researching over the last 20 years actually would travel from battlefield to battlefield, and they would offer their services. Now, of course, many soldiers, we know, were simply buried at the battlefield where they died. But again, many individuals or their friends and family knew that the individual didn't want to simply rest in a grave far away from family, so they were then ultimately prepared, sanitized. The agents of destruction, or what we know as bacteria, was removed or destroyed, and the individual was put in a good enough condition so that the body could then be sent home. And so again, the process then, over 150 years ago, is the same as it is today. The mistaken belief that I mentioned regarding embalming during the Civil War, I think comes from the perspective that many people, especially those who at least know a little about Abraham Lincoln's history, knew that Abraham Lincoln's body was embalmed because without that embalming process, without that sanitation process, his remains would not have been in a viewable condition over a 19-day period of time when they actually traveled from Washington back to Springfield for ultimate entombment. And so many people became more aware of the embalming process simply because their loved ones were being prepared on distant battlefields and then sent home. And so even local undertakers were fascinated by the concept because in their own experience, individuals who died under their care or in their community would probably have been buried immediately or within 24 to 48 hours, when decomposition or the deterioration of the remains would have gotten to be so unpleasant or unviewable, unpleasant for viewing, that the individual needed to be ultimately buried. And so really the process of embalming during the war was one that really provided a helpful service that was provided by Lyford and other embalming surgeons who were actually trained medical professionals who simply took their knowledge of medicine and anatomy and physiology and chemistry and applied it to this service. And then following the war, almost all of them returned to their medical practices. But as you might imagine, it was a fairly lucrative practice for those individuals who applied it or offered their services, either by hanging posters at a battle site or putting up posters in small towns or advertising in large daily circulation newspapers in order to become better known. There were more embalming surgeons practicing out in the eastern theater of battle during the Civil War because they were closer to cities where they actually lived. But there were actually embalming surgeons who set up semi-permanent establishments in Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, Tennessee, Huntsville, Alabama. So we have a variety of individuals, again, doctors, who were able to offer their services and then simply return to private practice after the war. And when you stop to think that embalming an individual at the beginning of the war would have netted the embalming surgeon a $15 fee, which was a fairly high fee in the early 1860s for treating one individual, and that would not include the cost of the coffin or the cost of the actual transportation itself. And slowly, as people discovered the benefit of the process and the service, then those fees slightly increased. And they were not established as standard. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of hucksterism and a lot of self-promotion. And so it wasn't until we get to very late in the war that because of some abuse of families and some situations that were caused by the embalming surgeons themselves, the War Department then ultimately stepped in and began issuing mandates and rules. And so in very early 1865, of course very close to the end of the war, then there were going to be regulations and standard charges put in place. So that gives you a background of what it is that I try to do. And at a typical event, you see me dressed today simply as an undertaker, appropriate for the task of burying the dead, but also as a citizen, as a civilian, because the embalming surgeons were civilian personnel. They were not military personnel by any means. They had absolutely no military authority or standing. They weren't attached to the medical service department, operating under the supervision of the Surgeon General in Washington, which was also then a division of the War Department. And so these individuals, as I mentioned before, would simply travel. So these civilians took time out of their life, and by comparison, as I mentioned, they might charge $15 early in the war. By 1863, we know that many of the embalming surgeons were charging $25 for enlisted personnel, and they were charging $50 for officers, twice the amount. And the reason, from what I can tell in research, is that the embalming surgeons fully understood that officers were receiving a higher rate of pay. It was certainly more typical that an officer's family or the community where an officer came from would definitely want to have their celebrated military hero sent home after either a heroic death in battle or even a defeat. But actually it was not unlike military veterans today. We want to honor them and their service. And so those officers' families in the community would want to have the remains shipped home, where that life could then be celebrated in the local community. And so one embalming surgeon was even charging, I believe it was $35 for enlisted personnel, and then $80 to simply provide the embalming service. And so I'm not certain what the actual translation or the dollar value today would be, but when the daily average wage for a common laborer was only 50 cents, even $15 early in the war, or ultimately $25 or $50, was more than a month's pay for a private in the army. So fairly expensive. And then coffins, of course, were an additional charge. And there were wooden, plain pine coffins, as one might expect. But then there were also very fine walnut coffins that were much more elaborate. There were sheet steel or sheet iron coffins and burial cases that could be purchased, again, at additional cost, depending on the family's means. And many people that I speak to at events immediately assume, again, because we're talking a period of time over 150 years ago, that, well, the process was probably very primitive. It was probably not the same sort of process, or it was not the same effective process that was performed today. And I like to then mention Abraham Lincoln specifically, whom we've already talked about. In Lincoln's case, Lincoln was embalmed in 1865, rather quickly following his assassination on April 15th. And Lincoln's remains, as I mentioned, were transported back to Springfield. And his remains were viewed a number of times over the next 36 years. But finally, in 1901, following a complete reconstruction of Lincoln's tomb in its current location, Lincoln's remains were viewed for what would be the final time. And so you might expect there were curiosity seekers then, as there are today, and everyone wants to know what would Lincoln look like, or what did Lincoln look like, in this case, in 1901, 36 years after he was first entombed, he was embalmed and entombed. And Lincoln, using the process from 1865, was actually in a viewable condition. He was recognizable. The men who had served as an honor guard, who were business associates and citizens of Springfield in 1865, who attended the funeral in 1865, also now were elderly men in 1901, but they were brought in because they, of course, knew Lincoln in life, and they were allowed privately to view the remains, and they did, and they confirmed that despite a slight darkening of the skin tone, his face was still recognizable. There had been some deterioration of a silk U.S. flag that had been placed across his chest. It had deteriorated to powder, but the remains were present. They were recognizable. They weren't horribly disfigured or misshapen. And so, despite what we might think a primitive process, again, it was a process of chemical injection that simply destroyed bacteria and was effective. And we know that even today, using modern methods of embalming, there are other factors that can influence decomposition and the change that occurs in the deceased. But in my experience over the past 20 years working with funeral directors to become a subject specialist in this area and be able to interpret it for the public, I've talked to practicing licensed funeral directors who say that they can't even count on that degree of preservation in all cases, despite all of the modern chemicals and knowledge and much greater knowledge of anatomy and physiology and a more thorough process. Because again, the process, as I've repeatedly said, it was not really a primitive process. It was simply not as thorough a process in 1865 as a modern funeral director performs today. But it is still the same process of sanitation and disinfection, which ultimately leads to preservation. So with that, as I mentioned, that is how I typically appear and do a presentation for probably 35 to 40 minutes over the course of a reenacting event. And the public, over the past 10, 12 years actually, that I've been doing this for the public, is always very fascinated, and it leads to a number of questions that usually extends the presentation out because, of course, people want to talk about Lincoln. They want to talk about and speculate about the local Civil War veteran that's buried in their local cemetery. And so through asking questions, I'm able to answer them from a historical perspective, but at the same time, just like a modern funeral director, I can certainly provide a certain amount of psychological closure if people are looking for that and are dealing with the loss of a loved one currently, because again, the loss of an individual 150 years ago is really no different than the loss of a loved one today.